Marcus Thorne was a king sitting on a broken throne, a billionaire who could buy anything in the world, except a cure for his own son, Leo, who lay silent and still in a 3-year-long coma. One day, a homeless boy, no older than his son, slipped past security into the sterile hospital room and made an offer that was both an insult and a prayer. "Give me food, and I will cure your son." Marcus laughed, a cold, bitter sound. In front of the entire hospital staff, he humiliated the child. The powerful man mocked the poor boy, until a nurse's scream from inside the room turned all the laughter into a stunned, supernatural silence. This is just the tip of the iceberg. To find out how this impossible story ends, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss what happens next. The air in the private hospital wing smelled of money and antiseptic. For 3 years, this had been Marcus Thorne's kingdom, a glass palace built on a foundation of grief, with him as its sole powerless king. He sat in a leather chair that cost more than a car, his tailored suit perfectly pressed, but his eyes were bloodshot with a fatigue that no amount of wealth could cure. He was a titan of industry, a man who bent markets to his will, but in this room he was just a father watching the steady, heartbreaking beep of a machine that was breathing for his son. Leo Thorne, age 10, looked like a sleeping prince, untouched by the world. But it was a sleep from which no doctor, no specialist, and no experimental treatment could wake him. The world saw Marcus Thorne as a predator, a shark in a suit. But here, his empire meant nothing. His power was a useless illusion. The silence was broken not by a machine, but by a sound that didn't belong, the soft scuff of worn-out shoes on polished marble. Marcus looked up, his irritation flashing. Standing in the doorway was a boy, just as small as Leo, but worlds apart. His clothes were thin, his face smudged with dirt, but his eyes held a strange and unnerving calm. Before Marcus could roar at the security for their failure, the boy spoke. His voice was quiet, yet it filled the entire room, cutting through the hum of the electronics. "Give me food," the homeless boy said, his gaze fixed not on the billionaire but on the sleeping child in the bed. "And I will cure your son." Marcus Thorne stared, the boy's impossible words hanging in the sterile air. The grief in his heart curdled into a cold, sharp rage. Marcus grabbed the boy's thin arm, his grip like iron. He dragged him out of the room and into the gleaming white corridor where nurses and staff immediately froze, their eyes wide. This was Marcus Thorne's domain, and a trespasser had been found. Here, he could be the king again. "You think you can come in here and mock my suffering?" Marcus's voice was low and dangerous, each word dripping with venom. He saw the boy not as a child, but as another vulture, another charlatan promising a miracle for a price. "You want food? Is that what this is about? A little performance for a meal?" He reached into his pocket, pulled out a thick wad of cash, and threw it on the floor. The $100 bills scattered across the polished tiles like dead leaves. "There," he sneered, his face a mask of contempt. "Buy yourself a feast. Now get out of my sight before I have you thrown in the street where you belong." 2 large security guards appeared, grabbing the boy by his shoulders. Eli didn't struggle. He simply kept his calm eyes on Marcus, a look not of fear but of pity. The staff watched, their silence a mix of fear and judgment. The guards began to drag the boy away, the sound of his worn shoes squeaking against the floor. And then came the scream. It wasn't a scream of pain, but of pure, unadulterated shock. A nurse, her face as white as her uniform, burst out of Leo's room, her hand covering her mouth. "Mr. Thorne, come quickly! It's Leo!" Marcus's blood ran cold. He shoved past the nurse and bolted into the room. The money on the floor was forgotten. The boy being dragged away was forgotten. All that mattered was the sight before him. On the bed, Leo was looking at the ceiling. His eyes, which had been sealed shut for 3 long years, were wide open. They were vacant, unfocused, but they were open. The steady beep of the life support machine seemed to pound in Marcus's ears. He turned back to the hallway, his heart hammering against his ribs, but the homeless boy was gone. And in the deafening silence of the room, a terrifying question began to form in his mind. What had he just done? The miracle was a fleeting whisper, and in its wake, a storm of confusion descended. For 24 agonizing hours, Marcus Thorne lived in a new kind of hell. One built not of silence but of false hope. Leo's eyes would open, his gaze milky and unfocused, and a team of the world's most expensive neurologists would descend with their machines and their hushed academic tones. They pointed to flickering screens showing bursts of synaptic activity where before there had been nothing. They called it a significant, unprompted neurological event. They used words like anomaly and unprecedented, but they offered no explanations and, more importantly, they offered no cure. Just as quickly as they appeared, the flickers of life in Leo's eyes would fade, and the boy would recede back into the silent depths of his coma, leaving Marcus alone with the crushing weight of a miracle that wouldn't stay. Marcus paced the floor of his son's room, a caged lion in a bespoke suit. His mind, the same ruthlessly logical instrument that had built a billion-dollar empire from nothing, was at war with itself. Coincidence. It had to be a coincidence. A 1 in a billion chance, a spontaneous remission that happened at the exact moment he was humiliating a child. He clung to that thought, repeating it to himself like a mantra. But the mantra was weak, a flimsy shield against the memory that played on a torturous loop in his head. The image of the boy, Eli. He remembered the child's eyes, not filled with the fear or anger he had expected, but with a profound and unsettling pity. It was the look of a judge gazing upon a man who had already condemned himself. He remembered the quiet certainty in the boy's voice, a promise made with the gravity of a natural law, and he remembered the searing shame he felt when the nurse's scream had echoed in the hallway, a sound that felt like a divine judgment on his own cruelty. His logic told him it was impossible, but his soul, a part of himself he had long since buried under layers of ambition and cynicism, knew with terrifying certainty that it was true. He had been offered a gift, and in his arrogance he had thrown it back in the face of the divine. Sleep offered no escape. When he finally collapsed onto a couch in his office, his dreams were haunted by falling $100 bills turning to ash and the sound of his son's heart monitor beeping in time with the soft scuffing footsteps of the boy he had cast out. He woke up in a cold sweat, the taste of bitter coffee and self-loathing in his mouth. The doubt was gone, burned away by a night of torment. In its place was a singular, terrifying conviction. That boy was the key. He was not just the cure, he was the cause. In the cold light of dawn, the predator reawakened, but with a new, desperate prey in his sights. He called Gavin, his head of security, a man accustomed to digging up corporate secrets and tracking rival executives. Gavin listened in stunned silence as Marcus, his voice ragged and stripped of its usual authority, gave him his new mission. "Find him," Marcus ordered, his voice cracking. "Find the boy who was here yesterday. I don't care what it takes, what it costs. Use every camera in this hospital. Scan every traffic light in a 50-block radius. I want every security analyst at the company on this. Forget quarterly reports and market analysis. This is the only thing that matters now." Marcus's penthouse office, usually a monument to cold corporate power, was transformed into a frantic command center. Financial charts were replaced with sprawling maps of the city, marked with grids and potential sightings. Analysts who typically tracked stock fluctuations were now scanning thousands of hours of grainy CCTV footage, searching for the face of a single anonymous child. But the boy had vanished. It was as if he had walked out of the hospital and simply dissolved into thin air. He wasn't on the street cameras. He didn't appear on any bus or subway footage. For 2 days, the most powerful surveillance network money could buy was defeated by a child with nothing to his name. The frustration inside Marcus grew into a raw, primal panic. He had the power to move mountains of money, to build or break entire companies, yet he could not find one small boy who held his son's life in his hands. Late on the second night, as the city glittered below, a junior analyst, a young woman with tired eyes, called out, "Sir, I think I have something." It wasn't much. A single blurry image from a privately owned camera on the roof of a warehouse, miles away from the hospital. The camera was old, the lens smudged, but for a few seconds it had captured a small figure walking towards the old industrial district, the forgotten part of the city, a sprawling ghetto of abandoned factories and homeless shelters. It was a needle in a continent-sized haystack, a ghost of a chance. But it was all he had. Marcus stared at the pixelated image on the giant screen, the ghost of a boy who held the key to everything. The desert of his doubt had been crossed, And on the other side was a truth he was now racing against time to find. He turned to Gavin, his voice no longer cracking with despair, but hardened with grim resolve. "Get the car. We're going there now." The Bentley felt like an alien spacecraft as it crawled through the decaying streets of the industrial district. Here, the glittering skyscrapers of Marcus Thorne's world were just a distant, mocking silhouette on the horizon. The buildings were brick and rust, their windows like vacant eyes. People huddled in doorways, their faces etched with a weariness that Marcus had never known. He sat in the supple leather of his car, a king driven into exile, the stench of urban decay seeping through the vehicle's climate. Control. Gavin drove in tense silence, his hand never far from the holstered firearm beneath his jacket. This was not their world, and the desperation in the air was a tangible threat. They found the shelter in the shadow of a derelict gasometer. It was a former warehouse, its corrugated metal walls scarred with graffiti. The sign outside was faded, simply reading, "St. Jude's Welcome Center." Marcus stepped out of the car, his $1,000 shoes landing on cracked, oil-stained pavement. The crisp night air was thick with the smell of diesel fumes and, faintly, cheap soup. For a moment he hesitated. Every instinct screamed at him to get back in the car and let Gavin handle it, to throw money at the problem from a safe distance. But the image of Leo's open, vacant eyes propelled him forward. He was a supplicant now, and this was his church. Inside, the vast space was filled with the quiet hum of human misery. Rows of cots lined the concrete floor, each a tiny island in a sea of despair. The air was heavy with the sounds of coughing and the soft murmurs of conversations that went nowhere. People looked up as Marcus entered, their gazes a mixture of curiosity, resentment, and utter indifference. They saw the suit, the expensive watch, the aura of power that clung to him like a shroud, and they knew he did not belong. He was a tourist in their suffering. A weary woman with kind eyes and a stained apron approached him from a makeshift kitchen. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice gentle but firm. Marcus, a man used to barking orders, found himself struggling for words. I'm looking for a boy," he said, the words feeling clumsy and inadequate. "His name might be Eli." The woman's expression softened. "Eli? Of course, he's over there." She pointed toward a quiet corner where a small group of children were gathered around a single bare light bulb. One of them was meticulously breaking a small piece of bread into even smaller pieces, handing one to a younger, crying girl. It was Eli. Marcus's heart pounded in his chest. He walked over, his footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. The children fell silent, watching him with wary eyes. Eli looked up, and the calm, knowing expression was exactly as Marcus remembered. There was no surprise, no fear. It was as if he had been expecting him. Marcus opened his mouth to speak, to plead, to demand, but the boy spoke first, his voice quiet but clear. "You don't remember us, do you?" The question hung in the air. Marcus searched the boy's face, his mind racing through a database of acquisitions, board members, and business rivals. He found nothing. The boy was a ghost, a stranger. "What are you talking about?" Marcus asked, his voice rough. "The bakery," Eli said simply. "On 6th Street, the Sunrise Bakery. My mother baked the bread. My father ran the counter. We lived upstairs." The words meant nothing to Marcus. 6th Street was the site of his crowning achievement, the Thorne Tower, a pillar of glass and steel that scraped the sky. To build it, he had acquired and demolished an entire city block. He had crushed dozens of small businesses in the process. They were just names on a spreadsheet, obstacles to be removed. "My sister, Lily, loved the smell of the flour in the morning," Eli continued, his voice never changing its calm, factual tone. "Then the letters started coming. From Vance Holdings. That was your company's name then. You wanted our building. My father said no. He said the bakery had been in our family for 3 generations. Eli looked directly into Marcus's eyes. Then the power went out. The city said it was an accident. Then the water was shut off. Another accident. We couldn't bake. We couldn't live. The lawyers you sent said my father owed thousands in fees he didn't understand. He fought until we had nothing left." A cold dread began to creep up Marcus's spine. He remembered the project. He remembered a subordinate complaining about a few stubborn holdouts. He remembered his own clipped response. "Handle it. I want that block cleared by the end of the quarter. I don't care how." "We were evicted in the fall," Eli said. "We had nowhere to go. We lived in a car for a while until the police took it. That first winter on the streets was cold." He paused, and for the first time a flicker of pain crossed his face. Lily got a cough. It never went away. By the time we got her to a clinic, it was too late. Pneumonia. She was 6 years old. The world tilted under Marcus's feet. The noise of the shelter, the smell of the soup, it all faded away into a deafening roar in his ears. He could see it now, a file on his desk, a signature he had scribbled without a second thought. An obstacle removed, a family destroyed, a child dead. Eli took one last devastating step, connecting the final pieces of a puzzle Marcus was too horrified to comprehend. "She died on a Tuesday morning in November," the boy whispered, his voice finally trembling. "The nurses at the clinic said the official time was 11:42 a.m. My mother told me later she read in the paper that was the exact same day, the exact same hour, that your son Leo fell into his coma. It was a mirror. The boy was a mirror, and in him Marcus Thorne saw the reflection of a monster. His greed hadn't just built a tower, it had dug a grave. The sickness that had invaded his sterile, perfect world was born here, in the cold and the dirt, from a father's pride and a little girl's last rattling breath. The quest for his son's cure was over. The desperate, agonizing quest for his own redemption had just begun. He tried to speak, to apologize, to scream, but no sound came out. He could only stare at the face of the boy whose life he had shattered, a boy who now held not just his son's life, but the entire worthless weight of his own soul in his small, steady hands. The confession settled not like a bomb, but like a shroud, smothering all the air from Marcus. Thorne's lungs, his legs gave out. He stumbled backwards, catching himself on the edge of a flimsy metal cot which groaned under his weight. The faces in the shelter, which had been a blur of anonymous poverty, sharpened into a jury of individual judging eyes. The man who owned the sky, who lived in a tower that bore his name, was now a pathetic figure, brought to his knees in a homeless shelter by the ghost of a 6-year-old girl. His whole life, his entire identity as a winner, a titan, a force of nature, was a lie. He was nothing more than a common thief, a man who had stolen a family's future and in the process had murdered a child. The sickness in his son was not a random tragedy. It was a debt coming due. A man and a woman emerged from the shadows of the shelter, drawn by the sudden silence. The man was thin, his shoulders slumped with a permanent exhaustion, but his hands were clenched into fists. The woman's face was a hollow mask of grief, her eyes looking at something far away, something only she could see. They were Eli's parents, David and Sarah. As their eyes fell on Marcus, a flicker of recognition ignited in David's gaze, quickly consumed by a wave of pure, unadulterated hatred. He took a step forward, his body trembling with a rage that had festered for 3 long years. "You," he breathed, the word a curse. "It's you." Gavin, who had been standing guard by the entrance, moved instantly, placing himself between his boss and the grieving father. But Marcus waved him off with a trembling hand. He deserved this. He deserved whatever was coming. He looked at the faces of the parents, at the father's burning rage and the mother's deadened soul, and saw the true cost of his ambition. It was a price paid in blood and tears, a price he had never even bothered to calculate. His mind, reeling from the impact, defaulted to its only known solution: money. It had always been his weapon, his shield, his answer to everything. I can fix this," stammered, the words sounding hollow and obscene even to his own ears. He fumbled for his checkbook, his hands shaking so violently he could barely hold it. "I'll give you anything. A house, 10 houses, a trust fund for your son that will make him richer than you could ever imagine. Just name a price, please." David let out a choked, bitter laugh that sounded more like a sob. "A price?" he spat, his eyes welling with tears of fury. "You want to put a price on my daughter, on Lily? You stand there in your perfect suit, and you think you can write a check that will fill the hole you dug in our lives? Your money is poison. It's the same poison that killed my little girl." The rejection hit Marcus harder than any physical blow could have. He finally understood. His power was gone. His wealth was not just useless here, it was an insult. He was stripped bare of every defense he had ever known, left with nothing but the vast, empty chasm of his own guilt. The king was a beggar, now pleading for something that could not be bought. It was then that Eli stepped forward, placing a small hand on his father's trembling arm. The boy's touch seemed to drain the rage from David, leaving only a shuddering exhaustion in its place. Eli turned his calm, ancient eyes back to Marcus. There was no anger in them. There was no hatred. There was only a deep, sorrowful understanding that was more devastating than any accusation. The power in the room had fully inverted. The billionaire was the helpless child, and the homeless boy was the arbiter of his fate. "This isn't a punishment," Eli said, his voice soft but carrying an undeniable authority. "God doesn't punish. He only balances. When you built your tower, you cast a shadow so dark that you could no longer see people like us. Your soul went to sleep. Your son's sleep. It is a reflection of your own." The simple spiritual logic of it was undeniable. It resonated with a truth far deeper than any market analysis or legal contract. Marcus was a man staring into the abyss of his own making, and this child was the only one offering a rope. His arrogance, his pride, his cynicism, it all dissolved into a single, desperate plea. He looked at Eli, his vision blurred by tears he didn't know he was crying. "What do I do?" he whispered. The words a surrender, an admission of his complete and utter failure as a man. "Tell me what I have to do. I'll do anything." Eli looked at him. Then his gaze traveled around the shelter, at the weary faces, the hungry children, the rows of cots that represented the human cost of a city that had left them behind. He looked back at the broken billionaire, the man who had taken so much and given back nothing. "To heal your son," Eli said, his voice clear and steady, "you must first feed everyone you have starved." Marcus Thorne left the shelter a fundamentally different man, yet his instincts remained the same. He was a problem solver, a fixer, and the cryptic command from Eli, "Feed everyone you have starved," presented itself to his mind as the ultimate logistical challenge. The guilt was a fire in his gut, but the need to act, to control the situation, was the only way he knew how to fight it. For the first time in 3 years, he had a mission that felt possible, a path out of the helplessness that had consumed him. He interpreted the boy's words with the literal, brutal efficiency of a CEO. The city had hungry people. His sin was ignoring them. The solution, therefore, was simple. He would unleash the full, overwhelming force of his fortune upon the problem. Back in the silent, moonlit penthouse that served as his office and home, the old Marcus Thorne flickered back to life. He wasn't driven by profit now, but by a desperate need for atonement. He paced before the floor-to-ceiling windows, the glittering city spread beneath him like a galaxy of souls he had failed. He made calls with a speed and authority that sent shockwaves through his organization. He roused the director of his charitable foundation from her sleep, ordering her to liquidate tens of millions in assets. "I want soup kitchens," he commanded, his voice raw. "Not one, not 10. I want one in every borough by the end of the month. I want mobile food banks, partnerships with every grocery chain. I want this city so flooded with food that no one, not a single man, woman, or child, goes to bed hungry. Spare no expense. This is now our only priority." For a few hours, it felt like enough. He was doing something. He was fixing it. He was following the instructions. A fragile sense of hope began to bloom in the wasteland of his guilt. He could solve this. He could buy his son's life back, not with a single check, but with 1,000 of them. An avalanche of charity that would wash away his sins. He was feeding the hungry. He was on the path. The illusion was shattered by the arrival of his chief legal counsel, a man named Henderson, who entered with a stack of documents and the perpetually worried expression of someone paid to anticipate disasters. He laid a thick folio on Marcus's marble desk. "Sir, the final demolition permits for the Olympian project came through. We need your signature to commence the clearing of the 6th Street site next week." Marcus froze, the name of the street hitting him like a physical blow. 6th Street, the site of the Thorne Tower. But this was a different project, on the other side of the industrial district. He numbly opened the folio. The project was a state-of-the-art, multi-billion-dollar luxury condominium complex, the Olympian, a place for new gods to live in the sky. And under the section marked Structures for Demolition, he saw the address. The same address as the St. Jude's Welcome Center. The room began to spin. This was his test. He saw it instantly. It was a perfectly designed, diabolical trap laid by fate itself. He was poised to spend a fortune feeding the homeless, while his own company was simultaneously preparing to make hundreds of them homeless all over again, including the very boy who held the key to his salvation. Eli's words echoed in his mind, and he finally understood their true meaning. Feed everyone you have starved wasn't just about food. It was about security. It was about dignity. It was about shelter. It was about stopping the very engine of greed that created the hungry in the first place. And right now, that engine was his own company. "Stop it," Marcus said, his voice a hoarse whisper. Henderson blinked, confused. "Sir, stop what?" "The project, the Olympian. Stop it. Kill it now." Henderson paled. "Mr. Thorne, we can't do that. We have contractual obligations, investor agreements. The entire project is pre-sold based on architectural plans. We would be facing hundreds of millions in lawsuits, not to mention the hit to our stock. The board would never approve. It would be professional suicide." This was the crossroads. The choice was brutally clear. On one path was his empire, his reputation, his shareholders, and the cold, hard logic of business that had guided his entire life. He could sign the papers, proceed with the project, and salve his conscience by relocating the shelter. A small, manageable cost. He could tell himself it was the responsible choice. This was the path of the old Marcus Thorne. On the other path was a complete unknown. Financial ruin. The fury of his board. A legacy destroyed. But it was also the path of redemption. It was the only way to truly honor Eli's command, to sacrifice a piece of his own greedy heart to protect the people he had wronged. It was a choice between his company's life and his son's. He walked to the window, staring down at the city. For his entire life he had seen it as a chessboard, a collection of assets to be acquired and leveraged. For the first time, he saw it as a collection of homes, of families, of beating hearts. He saw the face of David, filled with hate, the face of Sarah empty with grief, and the face of Eli calm and knowing. He turned back from the window, his decision made. The doubt and conflict were gone, replaced by a strange and unfamiliar peace. He finally knew what he had to do. He looked at Henderson, his voice steady and clear, imbued with an authority that had nothing to do with his net worth. "Stephen, listen to me very carefully. Cancel the Olympian project. Inform the contractors their services are no longer required and that our legal team will handle the fallout. And one more thing." He picked up his phone. "Schedule a press conference for 9 a.m. tomorrow. I have an announcement to make." The hours between Marcus Thorne's decision and the dawn of the new day were the loudest silence he had ever known. His phone vibrated incessantly on his desk, a frantic, buzzing swarm of unanswered calls. Members of his board, titans of finance, who had ridden his coattails to unimaginable wealth, left furious, pleading messages. His COO, Stephen Henderson, warned of a catastrophic stock collapse and shareholder revolts. The world he had built was screaming at him, threatening him, trying to pull him back from the edge of the cliff he was so determined to jump from. He ignored it all. For the first time in his adult life, the roar of the market was just meaningless noise. He sat in his penthouse, watching the sun rise over the city, a single framed photograph of his son Leo held gently in his hands. A strange sense of peace had settled over him. He was about to destroy his life's work, and he had never felt more free. When he walked into the press conference hall in the Thorne Tower, the room fell into a tense, expectant hush. It was packed with journalists, cameras, and investors, a sea of faces hungry for a story. The air was thick with speculation. Rumors had been swirling all morning about the cancelled Olympian project, and the company's stock was already in freefall. They expected an explanation, a damage control strategy, a display of the cold, calculated brilliance Marcus Thorne was famous for. They were about to witness something else entirely. He walked to the podium, not with his usual predatory stride, but with the quiet, deliberate steps of a man walking to his own execution. He looked out at the crowd, the blinding flashes of the cameras reflecting in his eyes. He cleared his throat, and the room held its breath. "Good morning," he began, his voice steady. "You are all here today for an explanation about a business decision, but to explain it I can't talk about market projections or fiduciary duties. I have to tell you a story about a small business. It was a bakery. It was called the Sunrise Bakery. A ripple of confusion went through the room. This was not what they expected. It was owned by a family, David and Sarah and their two children, Eli and Lily. They were a family that my company, in its relentless pursuit of profit, destroyed. Marcus's voice did not waver. He laid out the facts with the same brutal clarity he once used to describe a hostile takeover. He detailed the legal maneuvers, the manufactured code violations, the severing of their utilities. He confessed to every tactic, every sin. He named his own greed as the driving force. "We bankrupted them," he said, his gaze sweeping across the stunned faces. "We took their home, their livelihood, their history, and we threw them onto the street. We did this so I could build a taller, shinier building and add another comma to my net worth." He paused, letting the weight of his confession settle. "This is not an excuse. It is a fact, and it has consequences. Being homeless in this city in the winter is a death sentence for the vulnerable." Their daughter Lily was 6 years old. She died of pneumonia, a direct result of the poverty and exposure my actions forced upon her and her family. A collective gasp sucked the air out of the room. This was no longer a financial press conference. It was a public confession to a moral crime. "I have a son," Marcus continued, his voice thick with emotion for the first time. "His name is Leo. For 3 years, he has been in a coma from an illness the best doctors in the world cannot explain. I have come to believe there are some things that science cannot explain. I believe that my son's illness is a spiritual debt, a debt I owe to the family I destroyed, a debt I owe to the memory of Lily." He took a deep breath, standing at the precipice. This was the moment. Therefore, effective immediately, the Olympian project is permanently cancelled. The land on which it was to be built, one of the most valuable parcels of real estate in this city, will be donated. The entire development fund for the project, over $2 billion, will be repurposed. We are going to build something different there. We will build the finest center for community support this country has ever seen. It will provide not just shelter, but permanent housing, medical care, and job training for every single person who needs it. It will be a place of healing, a place of hope. He looked directly into the main television camera, speaking not to the reporters, but to the city, to the world, to the family he had wronged. "And this new foundation will not be run by me or by my board. It will be placed under the stewardship of a new board of directors, and I will be formally asking David and Sarah, Eli's parents, to lead it, should they choose to accept." It was done. The sacrifice was made. A pandemonium of shouted questions and flashing cameras erupted, but Marcus Thorne did not hear it. He turned away from the podium, away from the chaos of his collapsing empire, and walked off the stage. He had given it all away. He had destroyed the king, and in doing so had finally set the man free. Marcus Thorne walked away from the podium and did not look back. He left the blinding lights, the shouted questions, and the shattered remnants of his empire behind him. Gavin met him at the stage door, his face a mask of disbelief and concern, and escorted him through a private exit to the waiting car. As they pulled into the chaotic midday traffic, Marcus's phone, which had been buzzing with the fury of a dying hornet, finally fell silent. It was as if the world of finance, having screamed itself hoarse at his betrayal, had finally given him up for dead. An immense quiet settled in the car. It was the quiet of a battlefield. After the war is over, he had raised the white flag, surrendered unconditionally, and now there was nothing left to do but wait and see if his sacrifice had been accepted. He did not go to his office. He did not go to his penthouse. He simply told Gavin to drive. For an hour they moved through the city, a ghost in a luxury machine. Marcus stared out the window, looking at the faces of the people on the street. Before they had been abstractions, ants in the vast concrete farm he owned. Now he saw them as individuals, each with a story, a struggle, a hope. He had spent his life in a tower looking down, and only now, after giving it all away, was he finally on the ground looking them in the eye. He felt no regret for the billions he had lost. The money had been a weight, a gilded cage that had isolated him from his own humanity. For the first time, he felt light. Finally he spoke, his voice calm. "Take me to the hospital." The hospital staff parted before him like the Red Sea. The news of the press conference had spread like wildfire. They looked at him with a mixture of awe, pity, and stunned confusion. He was no longer the terrifying benefactor who ruled their halls with his checkbook and his temper. He was something else now, a man who had committed an act of glorious, spectacular madness. He ignored their stares and walked the long, gleaming corridor to his son's room, his heart a steady, quiet drum in his chest. He had made his offering. The outcome was no longer in his hands. He pushed open the door to Leo's room. Nothing had changed. The boy lay still in the bed, a pale figure tangled in tubes and wires. The machines beeped their monotonous, rhythmic lullaby of life support. For a long, terrifying moment, Marcus felt a cold wave of despair. Had it all been for nothing? Had he sacrificed his entire world only to be met with the same unrelenting silence? He had destroyed his past, and perhaps there was no future to be gained. The thought came without its old familiar sting. He walked to his son's bedside and sat down, not as a man demanding a miracle, but as a father who had come home. He gently took Leo's small, limp hand in his. "It's okay, son," he whispered, his voice thick with tears. "It's all okay. I'm here now. I'm not going anywhere." He sat there for what felt like an eternity, simply holding his son's hand, the quiet beeping of the machines the only sound. He expected nothing. He asked for nothing. And in that moment of complete surrender it happened. A flicker, an eyelash against a pale cheek. Marcus's breath caught in his throat. He leaned closer, his heart hammering. Then a finger on the hand he was holding twitched. It was a tiny, almost imperceptible movement, but to Marcus it was an earthquake. The beeping of the heart monitor, once a flat and steady rhythm, began to quicken, to strengthen. Slowly, as if rising from the deepest ocean, Leo's eyes opened. But this time was different. They were not vacant. They were not lost. They moved, scanning the room before finally settling on his father's face. There was recognition in them. There was life. A single, perfect tear rolled down Marcus's cheek and splashed onto their joined hands. The alarms on the machines began to chime, not with crisis, but with change. As nurses and doctors burst into the room, their faces a mixture of alarm and disbelief. They swarmed the bed, checking monitors, shining lights, speaking in urgent clinical tones. But Marcus saw and heard none of it. He only had eyes for his son. Leo's lips parted, and a small raspy sound came out, the first sound he had made in 3 years. He tried again, his brow furrowed with effort. And then the word came, a miracle whispered in the sterile air, a sound more valuable than all the gold in the world. "Dad." The doctors fell silent, staring in stunned amazement. Their charts and scans could offer no explanation for what they were witnessing. A boy, locked away in a persistent, vegetative state, was awake, aware, and speaking. It was impossible. It was a miracle. Marcus Thorne leaned forward and pressed his forehead against his son's, the tears flowing freely now, washing away the last 3 years of grief, rage, and guilt. His public sacrifice had liberated his soul, and in doing so it had brought his son's body back to life. 1 year later, on the piece of land where a monument to greed was once meant to stand, something far more valuable had risen. There was no cold glass or sterile steel. Instead, there was warm brick, sprawling gardens, and the sound of children's laughter. The sign at the entrance did not bear the name of a corporation, but the names of 2 children whose fates had become forever intertwined. It read, "The Lily and Leo Center for Hope." It was not a place of charity, which is often given from a distance. It was a place of community, built on the foundations of a sacrifice that had rocked the city to its core. The man who had once been the city's most feared corporate predator could now be found every day in the center's bustling cafeteria. Marcus Thorne no longer wore tailored suits. Dressed in a simple polo shirt and jeans, he stood behind the service counter, placing a ladle of hot stew onto the tray of a man who a year ago would have been invisible to him. The haunted, driven look in his eyes was gone, replaced by a quiet contentment, a peace that $1 billion had never been able to buy. He had lost an empire and, in the process, had found his soul. His days were no longer spent acquiring companies. They were spent learning the names of the people he was serving, hearing their stories, and offering not just a meal, but a moment of genuine human connection. His greatest wealth was often by his side. Leo, now 11 years old, was a vibrant, healthy boy, his laughter echoing in the halls that his father's sacrifice had built. The 3 years he had lost in silence were now a distant memory, replaced by the joy of a childhood reclaimed. He would often help his father serve the food, his presence a living, breathing testament to the miracle that had been born from an act of repentance. Their relationship, once strained by Marcus's ambition and neglect, was now the unbreakable center of his new life. They were not just father and son, they were partners in a life of service. The center was run not by a board of executives, but by the family whose suffering had been its catalyst. David and Sarah, their faces no longer masks of grief, but etched with a profound sense of purpose, managed the daily operations with a compassion that only those who have known true hardship can possess. The simmering hatred David once felt for Marcus had been replaced by a quiet, respectful partnership. They were two fathers bound by a shared history of pain and a common mission of healing. Sarah, who had lost a daughter to the cold, now made it her life's work to ensure no other mother would suffer the same. Fate, creating a warm, safe wing for families within the center. And Eli, the boy who had been a prophet, was now simply a boy. His old sorrowful wisdom was gone, replaced by the easy smile and bright eyes of a child who was safe, loved, and free to be young. He and Leo had become inseparable friends, their bond forged in a crucible of spiritual mystery that neither of them fully understood, but both of them honored. They were often seen in the rooftop garden, tending to the plants, two boys, from two different worlds, now brothers in a new one. One evening, as the sun set, casting a golden glow over the city, Marcus stood with Leo on the rooftop garden, looking out at the thriving center below. David, Sarah, and Eli joined them. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the lights of the center flicker on, a beacon of hope in the encroaching twilight. Marcus looked at the family he had once destroyed, and now stood beside. He looked at his own son, healthy and whole. He had nothing of the power he once craved, and yet he had everything that mattered. His kingdom was not a tower of glass and steel, but a community of healed souls. And his legacy was not a name carved on a building, but the quiet, undeniable warmth of a new dawn. If you like this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel to see more exciting videos like this one. Leave your like to support us and activate notifications so you don't miss any news. This helps us continue to create the best for you. Until the next video.